I am the designer of Sweet Juju, and I am here to tell you all about resin crafting for making accessories for J Fashion. Yay! So most of the things I'll be talking about in this panel are based on my own experiences. I've been doing resin crafting and making jewelry and stuff for about 5 years now. But 5 years isn't really a long time in practicing a craft. So a lot of things are still like, I'm learning new things every day. And I hope that you will learn something with this presentation too, whether you are interested in trying resin crafting for yourself, or if you just want to know how stuff comes together. I hope you'll enjoy. So this is my shop, Sweet Juju. These are all of my socials. I'll put this slide up again at the end if you'd like to reference it. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about the different types of resin. If you're not very familiar with resin crafting, you might not know, but there are a million different types of resin out there. Not just, the three main types that I'll be talking about, but even within those types, there's different types. So I'm going to break it all down for you. So the first type of resin I'm talking about is what's usually called fast cure urethane resin, which is like 10-minute resin. You mix it together in two parts, part A and part B, in a 1-to-1 ratio. And when you mix it, it's like already curing as you're putting it together. So you got to work fast with it. So this is the type of resin that I first started out with when I was first starting to experiment with, trying out molds and just seeing what happens when I, pour some goop into a cavity and it comes out as a solid thing. It's pretty crazy, but it's really fun to experiment with this. If you just want to try it out for yourself, you can find fast curing resin at pretty much any craft store, and it's pretty inexpensive also. So there are some pros and cons to this type of resin. As I mentioned, it cures really fast, so if you want to test out a mold just to see how it comes out, it's really good for that. It's pretty cheap, and it's also odorless and low VOC, which means that it's okay to breathe when you're around it, basically. But because it cures so quickly, it gets really hot in the cup. That's because when you mix the two parts together, it creates a chemical reaction, and that's how it solidifies. And, as it gets hot, it cures, and the heat makes it cure, and it just kind of, is a chain reaction. So you got to work really quickly with that. And you can only make opaque pieces with it because it cures white. So if you want to make clear things, then I don't recommend using urethane resin. But if you do want to make clear things, I would recommend trying epoxy resin, which is another type of resin that mixes in two parts. Some of them are in a 1-to-1 ratio. Some of them are in a 2-to-1, which means you mix like a large amount of resin and a smaller amount of hardener. It also cures when you mix it in the chemical reaction. Now you have a little bit of a longer time to work with it, usually about 30 to 40 minutes after you've mixed it together. It will start to become tacky and no longer pourable, basically. And it takes usually about 24 to 48 hours to cure fully. I say fully because that's when it becomes like you can't bend it anymore. But if you're really impatient like I am, you can usually take it out of the mold at like 12 hours and it'll be okay to handle, but it'll still be a little goopy. So I don't really recommend doing that unless you're in a rush, which I usually am. And the finished piece with epoxy will turn out clear, which is great for most applications. So pros and cons of epoxy resin. The good thing about epoxy is there's so many different kinds of epoxy resin out there. There's kinds that cure in a 1-to-1 or a 2-to-1 ratio. There's kinds that are thin and runny or thicker and more like goopy, syrupy. depending on whether you'd like to use it to cure a piece, to cast a piece, or to coat a piece. You have a lot longer time to work with it compared to the urethane resin. And you can basically find just about any project that you're working on, you can find an epoxy resin to suit that type of project. The downside of epoxy is that it can be very finicky if you're not using it under the right conditions, meaning that it likes a certain ambient room temperature and you need to be working in a dry environment because epoxy resin does not like moisture. If you get any water in the mixture, then it like bubbles up and turns into foam and it looks really weird and spooky. And it does take a long time to cure. So again, if you're really impatient like I am, that can be a struggle when you're first starting out and getting used to the whole process. Now, the last resin I'll be talking about is UV resin, which is a really fancy, exciting, special, magical resin because it only needs one part. You don't need to mix it together. It cures when it hits UV light or sunlight. So you can cure it either by putting it outside in the sun, or you could also get a UV lamp or a UV torch, kind of like what you would use for like a gel manicure. You can use the same type of UV lamp to cure UV resin. And that cures really fast with that lamp. It only takes like a minute or two, or you don't need a lamp if you live in a sunny area. And you just put it outside, which also works. And UV resin turns out clear, always. The pros and cons of UV, just like epoxy, it's available in really thin, runny types as well as thicker types. So you can find a type of UV resin to suit the project that you're looking for. It also is really strong if you want to use it as a glue. I usually use it for securing like ring bases to resin pieces. I find that it works a lot better for me than using industrial glue does. I just prefer using resin, and it's also faster than industrial glue. And I'm always in a rush. So the cons is that it is pretty expensive compared to epoxy resin. So if you want to cast a large piece, I don't recommend using UV for casting. It's better for doing smaller pieces. It's also usually got some pretty strong fumes, so you'll want to wear some eye protection and breathing protection as well. And because it cures with UV light, you can only make clear pieces. You can't make any opaque pieces with UV resin. Otherwise, the light won't find all of the pieces and it won't cure properly. So what kind of resins should you choose? There's so many different types. So you need to consider basically these four things, which are viscosity, UV resistance, the hardness, and the VOCs. And what does all that mean? Viscosity is how thick the solution is. So lower viscosity is really good for casting, especially in deeper molds. That's because the thicker that the solution is, the more likely that you're going to get bubbles trapped in there when you mix it. So you want to use a thinner resin for casting and a thicker resin for doming or coating. And that's because the thicker resin relies on the surface tension on top of the piece so that it kind of stays in one place and doesn't just spill out everywhere. There's a lot of science things going on, and it's like, I'm not a scientist and I don't know anything about physics. I only know about resin science. So if anything I say sounds like weird, if you're a scientist, I'm sorry. Now, UV resistance. Of course, if you're using a UV resin, they're all going to be UV resistant, meaning that they're not going to turn yellow under the UV light because they need UV light in the first place. But if you're working with a combination of epoxy resin and UV resin, for example, I like to cast my pieces in epoxy, and then for some of the pieces that I use, I like to coat them in UV to dome them or make them shiny. So because of that, I chose a epoxy resin that is UV resistant, so it doesn't turn yellow in the sunlight. But there are many types that do turn yellow, and sometimes you'll even see, if it shows a picture of the epoxy in the bottle, it'll already be yellow, and then that yellowing can get worse over time. Even if it's not exposed to light, just as the epoxy ages, the shelf life is usually about a year before it starts to turn like too yellow to really be useful. But if you're casting a dark piece, like if you're making a solid black piece, then that doesn't really matter. So if that's the main type of thing that you're going for, then you don't need to worry about UV resistant. So most of the time when you're casting a piece out of epoxy, it's going to be rock hard, rock solid. But UV resin comes in a variety of different hardnesses. Even the hardest ones I find are not as hard as epoxy. And that doesn't mean that, you know, it's squishy. It just means that it doesn't feel quite as slippery, meaning that it doesn't feel sticky, but like if you ever touch an epoxy piece versus a UV piece, it like your thumb doesn't move across it quite as quickly, if that makes sense. And it's also available in soft and gummy types. So if you want to make something like a gummy bear necklace and you want it to kind of be like gummy, you can do that with gummy type UV resin. Or if you want something to just be a little bit soft but not completely squishy, you can mix together a hard UV resin and a softer UV resin to kind of work out how smushy it's going to be. So, wait. Okay, this is important. So VOC stands for volatile organic compounds. Those are the fumes that are given off during the chemical reaction when the resin cures, either by mixing or by UV light. Usually it smells pretty strong, and you really can't get the smell off your clothes either unless you throw them in the wash. I find that a lot of times when I've been working with UV resin, I don't even realize that I got it on my clothes until I leave my workspace and I'm still smelling it and I'm like, oh my God. So then I have to go change my clothes. Some resins are low or no VOC, which means that you can use them without breathing protection. I still always use a respirator just to be safe, especially because I'm usually working with multiple types of resin as well as spraying on finishing spray. So just to be safe, I like to, you know, make sure I'm protected. Most of the times, resins that are VOC free will advertise that on the bottle. If it doesn't say VOC free, you should wear a respirator. Now, speaking of respirators, I'm going to tell you how to work with resin safely. Resin is a pretty toxic substance, I'm not gonna lie. So you wanna be protected. So, yes, respirators are a very kawaii accessory. This is what I actually look like when I'm working with resin. I am so kawaii desu. So you want to wear a respirator. That's that weird gas mask thing on my face. Gloves are absolutely essential. You want your hair tied back because if you get it in your hair, you're going to have a bad time. You'll want eye protection. And you'll also want to wear clothes that you don't mind getting resin all over because it's going to happen. No matter how careful you are, it's just going to get everywhere. Especially me because I'm really clumsy. So the respirator, you'll want to make sure that you choose a respirator filter that's good for organic vapors, which is the type of vapors that epoxy resin emits when it cures. And this is also good for if you're sanding the resin when you're finishing it, it also filters that as well. So it's a good catch-all filter for, you know, sanding, painting, casting. I recommend this type P100, which filters all of the things that you need to use. Gloves. You have to wear nitrile gloves. If you wear latex gloves, either it will inhibit the curing of your resin, or the resin will eat away at the gloves and you'll get it on your hands anyway. So it has to be those types. And you can buy them like in a box of like 100 of them. I mean, they've been a little bit more hard to come by lately, but you can find them pretty much most places. And eye protection, goggles preferably. Some respirators will come with a eyepiece attached, so it's like this whole single gas mask thingy. Whatever your preference is, most people prefer the full face respirator. I happen to prefer the half face one for some reason. I don't know, I just find it easier to put on and take off, I guess. Why do you need all that stuff anyway? Because being safe is kawaii, and you don't want to get sick. Respirator you need because resin fumes are really bad for you. Basically, when you breathe in the fumes that are given off by resin, the tiny particles settle in your lungs and they can accumulate over time when you use resin frequently, and it will make it more difficult to breathe in the future, and that's permanent. It doesn't go away. So you have to wear a respirator. Gloves and long sleeves because you don't want to get resin on your skin. Not only is it a pain to get off, it doesn't just wash off with soap and water. You need to like scrub it off with like pumice soap, which is the only thing I found that gets it off. But rather than risking that in the first place, just wear gloves and long sleeves because resin can irritate your skin. Even if it doesn't irritate you the first time that you touch it, the more that you work with it, the more likely you are to develop an allergy if you don't already have one in the first place. Some people find out the hard way that they have a resin allergy and break out severely when it touches their skin. So you have to make sure that you're protected. Usually, I mean, once the resin cures, it's safe to handle with your bare skin, but there are still certain things that you shouldn't make with resin. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And the eye protection, you want to wear the same thing with the fumes. The fumes can get into the mucous membrane of your eyes and cause them to swell up. And you don't want that to happen because you need to be able to see your resin and see other things. Okay, so you want to keep your workspace well set up also. You want to work in a well-ventilated area. Even if you're wearing a respirator, I mean, when you're done working, you're going to take it off and you're still going to be in that room. So you want to make sure you've got the windows open. If you've got an exhaust fan, that's amazing. Most people don't. I don't. So just keep the windows open. And you want to make sure that you're working in a space that is just for your resin crafting. You don't want it to be in an area where there are any pets or small children that can get to it. You don't want them messing with your stuff, and you don't want them inhaling any of the fumes. Just keep it away from them. It's not safe for babies and birds. And you want to keep your workspace clean because you don't want to be tripping over anything and knocking over your bottle of resin because that's bad. And also, when resin cures awkwardly on your table, it can be very sharp sometimes. So you don't want to cut yourself either. So you can put down a silicone mat or plastic bags to catch the resin as it falls when you're working, and then you'll be able to just strip that off and have a clean workspace for your next resin session. So every type of resin that is available will have a safety data sheet. This is available from the manufacturer of your resin, and it is a total breakdown of all of the different effects that the chemicals can have both on your personal health and on the environment when you dispose of them. Most of the time, things will be rated on a scale of like how dangerous they are, and it can be a little difficult to understand what all of those categories mean, but it will also give a list of recommendations like you should wear a respirator, you should wear skin protection, that sort of thing. And if you read further down the sheet, there will be information about how those levels of toxicity are determined. They are usually tested on animals, so you will If you don't want to read about that, you don't have to. You can just read the part that says wear a respirator and be like, okay, I'm good. But that is in that sheet, so be prepared to stumble upon that. So there are a few things that you should not make with resin. Even though it generally becomes inert once it's cured, there are still certain things that you don't want coming in contact with resin. You don't want to use them to make gauges for stretched ears. I see those a lot for some reason. You know, they come in certain plastics, and some people think, oh, what if I made that with resin? Don't make it with resin. And cutting boards are another popular item to be made with resin. You'll see them a lot on Pinterest and that sort of thing. But you don't want to use it on a cutting board that you're going to use for actual food. You don't want anything that you're going to be putting in your body to touch resin, because you'll get those tiny particles of resin in your system. You don't want that. You can make them for decorative cutting boards just to hang like on your backsplash. That's fine. But don't use it for food. Ashtrays and herb grinders. I don't know why people think it's okay to make herb grinders out of anything but like the things herb grinders are supposed to be made out of, but I have seen them made in resin groups. And, you know, when you grind them, you grind up little pieces of the grinder as well. So little pieces of resin are going to end up in the herbs that you are grinding. You don't want to be eating those or smoking those. So please don't do that. And anything else that you're going to be inserting into your body, don't make it out of resin. Just, you know, you don't want it in your internal system. Yes, there is food safe resin, but food safe resin is only rated food safe when you don't add any pigments or any other inclusions into it. Once you add any pigments or anything like that into it, it no longer becomes food safe. No biscuits either. Okay, so now that I've talked about safety, I'm going to tell you how to actually do the stuff and all of the stuff that you will need to do the stuff. So your basic tools, you'll want mixing and measuring cups, not only for epoxy, but also if you want to use UV, you can mix pigments in them as well. I use those little 1 ounce cups that, you know, you usually get like one of them on the top of a medicine bottle. You can buy them in bulk on eBay or Amazon or anything like that. And they also make silicone cups if you want to be able to reuse them. I don't usually like them because it's hard to get all of the resin off of the inside of them. I just use the disposable ones. I find it easier. Stir sticks, you want them to be plastic because if you use a wooden popsicle stick, wood has small amounts of moisture in it, and you want to prevent getting any moisture in your resin as much as you can, because that will cause it to bubble up and might cause it to cure weirdly. And you want, you know, whatever mold you're going to pour it into. Toothpicks I like to use to move bubbles out of the way and to make sure that the resin gets into every little nook and cranny of the mold. Now there's some extra tools if you want to get fancy. As I mentioned earlier, you can use a UV lamp such as the kind that you would use for a gel manicure to cure UV resin. This is the exact type that I use. It's very handy. It was like 20 bucks on Amazon and it's still going strong. My UV resin cures in like 30 seconds underneath it. You should probably leave it under that for longer, but it cures to the touch in about that amount of time. I use a palette to mix my pigments into my resin before I mix them into the full mixture. That is because you want to reduce the amount of bubbles you get as much as possible. And when you mix, you introduce bubbles into the mixture. So mixing a small amount before putting it into the big cup makes that happen less. Mold release spray, you want to use that usually for plastic molds, which are a little bit less flexible. And it's also good for conditioning your molds as well to keep them in good shape. Rotary tool like a Dremel I use to sand and buff and finish my pieces before I, you know, turn them into jewelry. And resin spray or polyurethane just to seal off any paint or, you know, rough edges that I sanded down to make it all look cohesive. Now, if you want to get super, super fancy, these are some tools that some resin crafters like to use to get the best results, you could use either a vacuum chamber or a pressure pot. Now these are both going to run you a pretty penny, but if you're looking to get serious about resin, you might want to choose one of these to really just reduce all of the bubbles in your resin, because you don't want bubbles. Most people who cast smaller pieces prefer a pressure pot. I use a vacuum chamber and I degas the resin before I pour it in after I mix it. Okay, let's talk about some fun stuff. Molds. So there are a couple different kinds of molds as well as bezels, which I'll talk about a little bit after I talk about molds. So silicone molds are pretty common. They're soft and they're flexible, so they're easy to get your piece out, and they can capture a lot of detail because it's like a pourable rubber kind of that coats the entire piece and picks it up with pretty much perfect detail. If you get a mold made out of silicone, it's sometimes more expensive, especially if it's custom made for you. And they also can sometimes, as you use them, after a while, they start to degrade, which means that the piece will be a little bit less shiny after a while. You can tell when that starts happening because it'll start to turn white. And at the end of its life, it'll start to stick more to the piece as you pull it out. And you might end up, ripping it a little bit. And that's how you know your mold is dead and it's time for a new one. Plastic molds. You can find these usually on Etsy. A lot of people make custom ones there. They're usually pretty cheap. You can find a small one like this for like $2. They also sell them at Hobby Lobby, which I don't go to, but some people get them there. They don't degrade quickly like silicone does. I have some plastic molds that I've been using for like 4 years and they're still great. They do get scratched up a little after use, but I always glaze my stuff anyway, so you don't see that. The downside is that they can't capture as much detail as a silicone mold would, because instead of a rubber being poured over the piece, it's like a sheet of plastic that gets vacuum sealed onto the piece. So it doesn't really get into all of the little nooks and crannies. And it's also a little bit more difficult to remove the piece from the mold because it's not very flexible. And because it doesn't capture a lot of detail, you might want to do a little bit more sanding and finishing afterwards. Just because of the nature of the mold, it doesn't create a perfect piece every time. So depending on what kind of piece you want to make, different types of molds might suit your needs better. If you want to make a smaller, more detailed piece, silicone mold is good for that. But if you're looking for a larger, like a simple shape, plastic mold is just fine for that. You can also make your own silicone molds. It's great for if you like to sculpt with polymer clay, or if you have access to a laser cutter and you want to make pieces out of acrylic and create molds from that, you can do that. It's really easy. You can buy the kit from Smooth On, which is a company that makes a lot of different industrial modeling products. You can, you can create molds with your own designs. You can remold some for your own personal use if you want to have like multiple of something, but you should not create a mold out of somebody else's design and sell it, because that's like a replica and that's bad. So it's really easy to just, mix it together and pour it over your piece, and you have a mold and you can make a bajillion more of the thing. Now there's also bezels, which are a little bit different because it's kind of almost a finished piece beforehand. All you need to do is add a little bit of resin in there and you can make it your own. And it's really fun and easy if you're just looking to play around with glitter and stuff like that. For an open bezel, you will need to put a transparent tape behind it. They make special tapes just for putting on bezels so that when you peel it off, it comes out still shiny. And you can find bezels in just about any design you want. There are simple ones and there are more complex ones. depending on what type of piece you want to make. Yes, thank you for mentioning that. For UV resin, you will need a translucent mold. And most of the time when you are looking for molds to make something with UV resin, it will be labeled for UV resin because it will be translucent. The ones that I showed earlier are those types of molds because these are, you can see through them. But the type made out of this green stuff, those you can't use with casting UV resin. Okay, now let's talk about making your stuff pretty with colors. So mica powder is a powder of a mineral called mica, and it is available in a ton of different colors. It can be either matte or sparkly or pearlescent. It's pretty cheap, and you can mix them together to make any kind of color you want. Mica powder is usually used in making eyeshadow. So if you have some old eyeshadow lying around and you want to see what color it turns your resin, that's a great way to start experimenting with it. Depending on the pigment type, it can make the resin either transparent or opaque. I have not figured out what makes what powders do what. Sometimes I get a set of mica and some of them come out translucent and some of them don't, and I don't know. You just have to experiment with it to see how it comes out. So alcohol inks are also really popular. They're usually used in painting, but they mix really well with resin. They give a really vibrant color, so you only need like a tiny speck of it. You can find them for pretty inexpensive on AliExpress and places like that, but you'll also be able to find more high-end ones for fine arts at like Blick and those kinds of art stores. And alcohol inks will always be transparent. So they're pretty good to use for UV resin, I would say. Liquid resin pigment, which is formulated specifically for use with epoxy resin. Usually they're not available in many colors, just the really basic ones like, red, blue, yellow, green, and white, black, and brown. And that's pretty much it. You can buy both opaque ones and translucent ones. They can seem pretty expensive. Like this little bottle can be like $7 or $8, but it will last you a really long time because just like with alcohol ink, you only need a tiny bit. And you can also mix and match the types of pigments that you use. So for example, to make my solid pieces, I always use mica powder. I just prefer it. But to make a opaque piece, I add a white resin pigment to it. And for the purple that I use, the purple mica powder I have is not quite as cool of a purple as I would like. So I add a little bit of translucent blue to it to make it more of a cool tone purple. So Mica Glitter is my absolute favorite. It's like mica powder, but it's little flakes of sparkly shininess instead. It's very lightweight, so it won't sink to the bottom of your resin. So even if you're using a very low viscosity resin, it will still hold up pretty well. It also, like when you pull it out of the bag or the container, it kind of like puffs everywhere and it's like magical, which obviously is not safe to breathe in, but you're wearing a respirator, so it's okay. Craft glitter, which you can get pretty much anywhere, the craft store. You'll want to use a mixture of this type of glitter. A lot of times people will use just, one type of glitter and it will end up making it look a little bit cheap. If you mix and match, it'll kind of give your piece a little bit more dimension and make it look a little bit more exciting. Confetti and decals also. You'll see these type of decals sold for nail art, but they're also really good for using in resin as well. They'll give like a nice little point of interest to your piece. I see them used a lot in bezel pieces because the metal on metal kind of complements each other really well. I don't use them very often, but I do use confetti pretty often. And you can also paint your resin pieces, whether you want to add pigments to them or not. You can paint them to give them a little more detail. For example, if the mold that you're using has a design or words on it, you can either paint directly onto the mold and then cast your piece, or you can paint the piece after you've cast it. You can use acrylic paint, like, you know, the cheap little ones that you get at the craft store. If you have model paint, that's better because it doesn't chip as easily. But either way, you are going to want to seal a piece with either polyurethane spray, resin spray, or another coat of resin. And you can also use puffy paint, which I like to use for making chocolate. As you can see here, for the donuts that I make, I use puffy paint. It's like a huge bottle of, you know, fabric paint that you get at Michael's for like $4. That's my secret. Okay, here's some tips and tricks for casting resin. So as I mentioned earlier, resin hates moisture. So you want to work in a dry environment. And the ideal temperature is about 72 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know what that is in Celsius, I'm sorry. You want warmth because warmth helps the resin to cure more quickly. So you can put the bottles in a bath of warm water. I usually put them like in a plastic bag and then in a like tall cylindrical takeout container of warm water. I put them in the plastic bags so that I don't get any water on the actual bottles and potentially into my resin. When you mix the resin together, you want to mix it very slowly because the faster that you mix it, the more bubbles and air that are going to get into your resin. You're not scrambling an egg, you are mixing resin. So do it slowly and carefully. You can also cover your work as it cures so you don't get any dust on it, especially if you are leaving something out to be glazed in epoxy. I always cover it. When I'm casting, it doesn't matter so much. And clean and condition your molds frequently because as they are sitting out, they're going to get dust and they're going to get stray pieces of resin drippings. And also as you use them, they're going to start to degrade. So you want to add mold release and conditioner to help keep them looking fresh. And as you can see, if you let a lot of bubbles get into your resin, it will come out looking like Swiss cheese. And unless you are making something that is supposed to look like Swiss cheese, you don't want that. To cover your pieces, I use like a big old Tupperware container without the lid, and I just put it on top. General tips. Safety first, always. If you cannot do it safely, you should not do it because I want you to be safe and I don't want you to get sick from using resin. So wear a respirator, wear gloves, wear eye protection. Super important. You can also join a community with fellow resin crafters, get some tips and tricks, or just to get inspired to see what everybody else is doing. The most important thing that you can do when you are resin crafting is to be patient because epoxy resin especially takes a long time to cure. And a lot of times when you cast something and you wait all day for it to cure and you finally take it out, it comes out looking like Swiss cheese. And you're like, no, but sometimes it just happens. You know, you can mix slowly and put your resin in warm water and use a degassing chamber and everything. And sometimes you still get bubbles and that's just how it is. So you gotta make sure that you have time set aside to get it right. And it's really frustrating. Cheese happens, it indeed does. The most important thing after safety is to look at what other people are doing. In my experience following other resin artists, everybody does it differently. Everybody has their own techniques and their own methods and way of doing things in addition to their own styles. And it's, you know, it's interesting to see what other people are doing and, you know, get inspired or just to be like, hey, I like what you made. That's cool. I want to buy it. You should support other artists. They're your friends. Speaking of other artists, I'm going to show you some other resin artists that I really enjoy who really inspire me. My absolute fave is Starlight Deco Dream. Everything she makes looks super juicy and delicious. She has like her signature mix of glitter that she uses to glaze everything. Everything is super cute, super great for if you like Area Kei or 80s fancy style. They're really great for that. I wear them with Sweet Lolita as well. I have thrown so much of my money at her, and you should too. Whimsy K is another artist that I really like. She did these Valentine's themed balloon style things recently. Now this necklace is a shaker, which I didn't talk about because I don't make shakers, so I don't have any experience with them. But basically you take a hollow piece of resin cast, you put a clear piece on top of it, and you can put confetti and glitter and anything else. And sometimes people put like contact lens solution or water, and then they seal it so that you have like a little mini snow globe type thing full of fun, pretty things. And Of a Long Lost Land. I really like how elegant her pieces are because she uses bezels in addition to cast pieces, which I don't really see very often. Usually people use bezels with UV resin, but she uses 2-part resin to cast these really beautiful rose pieces. I really love them. They're so pretty. And now I will show you a demonstration of how I make a resin piece from start to finish. Let's hope the video works. Yay! Okay. So I start out with a plastic mold to make the moon necklaces that I usually make. I spray it with mold release spray first and rub it in with my fingers. And while that's settling into the mold, I start to mix my resin. The resin, of course, was sitting in a warm water bath for a couple minutes before I started. The resin that I use is a 2-to-1 resin, so I have to measure it out pretty carefully. So I use 2 separate cups for that. And then I pour them together. The video is sped up like 4 times, so obviously you shouldn't mix this quickly because you don't want bubbles. No Swiss cheese. So you want to mix slowly and also scrape the bottom and the sides of the cup. And I usually pour it back and forth between the cups a few times just to make sure that I have an even mix and incorporate everything kind of, uniformly. And it takes a while. Usually because you're mixing slowly, it takes about 5 minutes to mix everything together and get that uniform mix. So I separate it into the 2 cups again, just to give the bubbles a chance to rise to the top. I have this little palette that's like an old macaron mold that I use to mix my pigments into my resin. So you see I took a little bit of resin and put it in one of the cavities, and I put some of the mica powder into it, and I mix it separately. So now I'm adding the tiny bit of blue pigment to the purple mica powder. And then I take a little bit at a time and mix it into the resin just to make sure that I get the right tint to it. And now that it's all colored together, I am going to add some glitter to it. So I add my mica flakes and also some iridescent craft glitter to it. And I also add a tiny bit of pearlescent powder. And once that's all mixed together, I put it in my vacuum degassing chamber to let the bubbles rise to the top. Now that everything is degassed, I put a thin layer on the bottom of the mold, and I am going to add some confetti stars to it. And this part is really fun because you get to really play around with like the design and the placement of the confetti. So I use a toothpick. After I use the toothpick to kind of move the bubbles out of the way, I use the wet toothpick to pick up the confetti out of the bags and place it into the molds. I use 4 different types of confetti for these moon necklaces. I put an open star that has like little stars next to it, and I have a closed star. Those are both white. And then I have clear iridescent stars and also clear iridescent 4-pointed sparkle things. And I put all of that together to give it dimension and to make everything sparkly and fun, so that, you know, I really like the iridescent ones because they are only visible when they catch the light a certain way. So they're kind of magical in that way. Okay, so I'm just about done placing all of the confetti, I think. Oh, no, I'm not. I'm adding more. So as you can see, I have a pink silicone mat down on my workplace. There's resin all over the rest of my table because I've been using the table for like 5 years and things happen. So make sure you keep your table clean. Don't be like me. Okay, I think this is the last bit of confetti that I'm adding in. There's so much confetti in this stuff, you guys. Okay, so after about 3 or 4 hours, I come back and I mix another cup of the purple resin with the glitters, and I don't add any confetti this time. This is just to add some more depth to the mold. Now I'm coming back another 3 or 4 hours later, and I'm mixing more of the purple translucent resin again, but this time I'm adding more pearlescent powder to it to make it a little bit more opaque. And I add another thin layer onto that. Now finally, for the last layer, I'm going to mix an opaque purple layer. So I use the same purple pigment, but I make it a lot darker, and then I add an opaque white to it. And you only really need a tiny bit of the white. I usually don't like to make it completely opaque. I give it kind of a milky look to it. And now I'm demolding it. And it actually takes a really long time because the plastic molds are kind of tricky. But thankfully, both of them came out good. Oh God, I didn't know there was sound in this part. I'm sorry. So, oh, whoops. Okay. Let's see if I can. Okay, nope. I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm so incompetent, you guys. How do I hide this thing? Oh no. Ah. Help. Okay, actually, wait. Sorry for the technical difficulties. See, every time I highlight over it, the toolbar comes back up. So I can't skip forward in the video. I'm sorry. Okay, well, while I'm letting that play again, I'll start to take some people's questions. And you can just watch that in the background. And hopefully the site will be muted correctly, so when the sending part comes on again, there's no sound. So if anybody has any questions while you are watching this mesmerizing process, feel free to ask me.
Yeah, that's true. You can imagine being in the custom industry.
The best way to clean or tidy the workspace. As I mentioned earlier, you'll want to put down a silicone mat or a, like cut up a plastic bag and tape it to your table. I kind of use a combination of both just because the silicone mats that you can find aren't very big. But when you use those, you can either, throw out the plastic bag or you can peel the resin off of the silicone mat once it's cured. Eventually it does accumulate onto the mat and it gets to a point where you can't peel it off anymore, and then you have to throw the mat out, but that's just how it is. So most of the time, I decide what I'm going to make just as I'm shopping for materials. I'll show a couple of resources for places I like to get stuff a little bit later, but I browse on Miniature Suite a lot. They have a lot of good, like they have bezels, which I don't use very often, but they also have a lot of different kinds of confetti and glitters and that sort of thing. They also have beads and, you know, they have some molds. I don't usually get my molds from there, but, you know, sometimes I'll see like, I'll just see a mold and I'll just, you know, envision it in my head. That's kind of what happened when I got these moons. I actually had a different design for the moons like many ages ago where I used one of the smaller ones. And then I decided that we deserve bigger necklaces. So I used the bigger part of the mold instead. So you can see one of the molds that I'm using is a lot older than the other one. I ended up buying the second one so that I didn't even realize that many moons ago. Yeah. Okay, next question. I don't even remember the first thing I ever made. Probably back when I first started resin crafting, this stuff wasn't nearly as readily available as it is now. There was like one kind of mold you can buy at Michael's, and it was a little palette for like Mod Podge hot glue gun casting, which I don't even know if people actually do that. But I used that to make little pieces with urethane resin, and I would paint them and then glaze them with resin spray. And they were really bad. The paint would chip. And, you know, I didn't know what kind of glue to use, and they would fall off the ring bases and that sort of thing. But it was fun for starting out. And I actually still use the chocolate bar cavity from that mold to make my chocolate bar rings. So that's probably the thing that I've been making the longest, is the little chocolate bar rings. So for two-part resin, it depends on the type of resin that you're using. Some kind of resins will say mix by volume and other kinds will say mix by weight. You have to read the instructions on the resin that you get. Personally, I recommend getting the type that mix by volume so you don't have to buy a scale. And now there's no sound and it's awkward. Okay, we're almost caught up with the video. My favorite piece that I have made recently. That's really difficult to answer, actually, because I feel like every time I make a new piece, I am like obsessed with it. So the most recent thing that I made that I released today for the marketplace was candy heart necklaces and rings. And those were really exciting to make because it was the first time that I worked with a mold maker who uses laser cut. So I designed the molds and I had them laser cut and make the mold for me. So that was really exciting, you know, to kind of bring my design to life in that kind of way, rather than using a mold that I just bought and was already there. Like these moon molds you can get pretty much anywhere. Okay, so now we're caught up. And now there's no awkward sound. So now I'm using my Dremel to sand off the edges of the cast piece. Usually when you cast something in plastic, you will get like, you know, some spillover. So you'll want to sand that down to make sure that there's no sharp edges. You don't have to use a Dremel or a rotary tool. You can use just regular sandpaper, but it is a lot faster with a Dremel. So after I sand it, I rinse it off with some water and dry it off. Make sure it's completely dry before this next step. Then I use UV resin to coat it. I use a little piece of tape on the bottom so that I can hold it and coat the entire front part of it, you know, without having to touch it. I put one thin coat around all of it, cure that, and then I put a second coat just on the top part to dome it to give it some dimension. And that kind of acts as a magnifying glass for the confetti inside as well. So that gives a pretty cool effect. Then I use the UV resin to put the bail on the top. That's the thing that gives it the little loop for the necklace. So I cure that, and then I put another coat of UV resin on the back, and I add a little bit of glitter just to make it exciting. Once that's all leveled off, I cure that again. And now the piece is finished. Yay! Sorry about that video mishap, guys. Okay. So finally, here are some resources if you want to learn more or if you want to find out where you can get some stuff. Here are some places that I like to get. I usually buy molds on Etsy because you'll find a lot of unique molds there, you know, from small businesses who make their own. You can also find things on Taobao and AliExpress and that sort of thing. But if you're not very savvy with finding those items on those websites, Miniature Sweet carries pretty much anything that you would normally find on Taobao or AliExpress. There's a bit of a markup, but they also give a lot of free gifts, and like the point system is very generous, so I like to use them. And I also like their UV resin. I'm not sure if it's like proprietary or they just put their own label on it, but I like it. And the Epoxy Resin store I really like because they are a small business, like a family business located in the US. They like make their own resin, which is great. And they also sell liquid diamonds, which is really popular among resin crafters who make jewelry because it's very low viscosity, no VOC, and it comes out like crystal clear. The one thing about liquid diamonds, though, is that it is not UV resistant. It does yellow over time. So you want to be conscious of that if that's something that matters to the types of projects that you're making. Okay, so that's everything now. So I'll take a few more questions. So I am not like smart. I just like started making stuff and started selling it like right away, which was probably not the best idea because, as I mentioned earlier, the stuff that I made when I was first starting out was awful. It was falling apart and the paint was always chipping and I just did not know what I was doing. And you know, you start like getting down on yourself because you're like, why is no one buying stuff? And then you look back like 5 years later and you're like, oh, it's because it was bad. But it's okay to be bad at it. You know, I was bad at resin for like 3 years before I started being good at it. So, you know, take your time, don't rush, make stuff, and look at what other people are doing. Okay. And those are all my links popping up in the chat. I don't know if anyone even like uses Tumblr anymore, but I still post there. Sometimes I get a couple notes. Are there any other questions we missed? Tumblr still has some pretty fire memes, I'm not gonna lie. Will I ever make cheese jewelry? That's a great question. I feel like I could make like, you know, I could mix resin really terribly and put it in like a square mold and it will come out as cheese. So maybe I'll try that. I feel like I would want to get like an actual cheese mold and make it properly though, if I ever actually did it, but it would be fun to experiment to see if I could purposely make Swiss cheese. B-grade cheese, yes. Unique, one of a kind. Actually, grilled cheese sandwich is a great idea. Charcuterie Kei. I think Lily of the Valley made charcuterie jewelry recently. That was really cute. I would like to make like something savory. Savory Juju. I will make one piece of cheese and you will all have to fight over it. Pizza, yes. I think if I ever make something savory food, the first thing that I would make is pizza. I did a pizza cord recently. Not recently, it was like over the summer, but everything in the past year is recently to me. And I had like a giant inflatable pizza slice. And that's when I peaked, honestly. Now I really want to make pizza jewelry. I gotta figure out, I'll probably have to like sculpt it and then make a mold. I kind of am not very good at sculpting. The only thing that I sell that I sculpted was my donuts. And those are pretty easy just because it's like you make a ball and then you smush it in the middle. Pizza might be a little bit more complicated, but now I really want to make pizza. I'll make like red and white and green beaded chains. Maybe I can find like Italian flag stripe ribbon to make the bow. Pizza Kei is a substyle now. Oh, a heart-shaped pizza would be really cute, actually. Did you guys see Q-Pot did pizza recently? And like the earrings are just like giant slices of pepperoni. And I can't stop thinking about them. I will not make pineapple on pizza. No, I refuse. I'm sorry. I'm a purist when it comes to Italian cuisine. Like, I'm the kind of person who will tell you that Alfredo does not have cream in it. I'm like that obsessive about Italian cuisine. I also like, just in general, don't really like pineapple. I don't like that it eats my mouth when I try to eat it. Okay. So if that's all of the questions that everybody has. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bring my hot food takes into this resin tutorial, but that's just how it is sometimes when you talk to me about food. Yeah, my next panel will be just me talking about Italian cuisine as it relates to resin crafting, specifically. We will only be talking about pizza jewelry, and there will be no pineapple involved. Okay, so I guess that's it. No, do not put Parmesan in your resin, please. Thank you very much to Area Kei for hosting me. I hope you guys enjoyed this panel. I hope you learned something or just had fun watching me fumble over how to play a video on the internet. If you have time, please fill out the survey. Let me know what you thought. Thank you, everybody.